Hello and welcome. In today's video I'm going to show you how to make one of these beautiful quilts, and would you believe it, it's all made from scraps of fabric. So on the front I've used quilt as you go squares, and on the back plain squares. You can have it either way round. I would prefer this side, but you can have it the other way if you want to, and it's very easy to make. So let's get started and I'll show you how to make one of these beautiful quilts.
For this project you will need 6 by 6 inch squares of batting or wadding, 6 by 6 inch squares of backing fabric. Now it depends on the size of the quilt you're making how many you will need. My quilt uses 8 across and 10 down, so I need 80 squares of each, but you may be making a bigger or smaller quilt, so it will depend on the size of your quilt. Then you will need sufficient scraps of fabric to cover 80 or however many you decide to use of your 6 inch squares. The equipment you will need is a quilter's ruler and a rotary cutter. If you have one, a small ironing mat or board, and of course a small iron, pins and a pin cushion, a pair of snips or a pair of small scissors, and if you're anything like me, an unpicker. I like to set my work area up with everything next to my sewing machine so I can be nice and efficient. First, I like to pair up my squares of backing fabric with my squares of wadding or batting. And if any of the fabric needs an iron, I give it a quick iron. I like to get ready about somewhere between 6 and 10 at a time, so I don't have too much to do at once and it's not too overwhelming. This first square that I'm doing, I'm going to do in straight lines across the diagonal, so I just need to neaten off any of my strips to make sure that they are nice and square. You can do them totally random, and I'll show you how to do a random one after this, but first we're doing this one, which is with nice straight pieces of fabric. Once you've sorted your first strip to go right across the diagonal, then you need to find another 2 strips, one to go each side, because in this case we can do 2 strips at a time, one on each side. So find yourself a contrasting strip to go on each side, and when you're happy you can pin in place. I put my pins in one direction on one side and then in the opposite direction on the other side, because I'm going to sew up one side and back down the other side. Then at your sewing machine, sew down each side, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish, and removing any pins as you go along. When you've done your first side, turn around and come straight back down the second side. Again, back tacking at the start and the finish. Then give a quick press before adding the next pieces of fabric. Next, add another strip to each side, again pinning in opposite directions, because when we're at the sewing machine we're going to sew down one side, turn the fabric around and sew down the other side. Then sew exactly the same as before, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish and removing any pins as you go along, then turning the fabric when you get to the end of the first strip and then sewing down the second one. As before, press the 2 pieces you've just added and find another 2 pieces, pin these in place, then sew down both sides, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, and press again. It doesn't look too good at the moment, but once you trim it down to size it looks a whole lot better. So on your cutting mat and with your quilter's ruler, cut it down to 6 inches. So start by levelling off one side, then make one turn and level off the next side. Line up your lines on your ruler with the side that you've just levelled, which is now on the bottom, to get your next side level. Then turn around again, we're always turning clockwise, level it up with 6 inches and get your straight line across the bottom, and then cut your third side, and then turn again, always turning clockwise, level it up again and cut your fourth side. Remember to close your rotary blade, and there we have one nice neat square for our patchwork quilt. That's the first one finished, only another 79 to go. Next I'm going to run through what I call a random square. So I'm going to start with a square in the centre, and actually I'm going to put it on an angle. So there's my centre piece, and then I'm going to put a piece each side of it. Next I can add 2 pieces at once, so I'm going to add a piece to each side with right sides facing, pin in place, and then I'll stitch the first 2 pieces down. Taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, sew down both sides. For speed I've just finger pressed these 2 out, and then I'm going to add the next piece, and again I'm going to match it on the other side. So I'm going to have the same piece or a similar piece of fabric on each side, and I'm going to pin them with right sides facing, and then sew down each side, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish, and removing any pins as I go along. Then I pin a matching piece of fabric in all 4 corners. Then sew all 4 pieces on, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Now this is what I call the ugly duckling stage. Now give it a good press. Then we can trim all the sides and it will transform into a beautiful swan. Just you see. So lining up with your quilter's ruler, cut one side first so you get one nice straight edge. Then turn clockwise and cut the next edge, lining it up all the time with your quilter's ruler. Continue until all your sides are nice and straight. And there's our beautiful swan. To join all of your squares together, you need to cut strips of fabric. The strips of fabric need to be 1.5 inches wide. So I'm using my quilter's ruler to measure the 1.5 inches and cutting with my rotary cutter. I have got just under 1 metre of fabric here, and I know there's not going to be quite enough to do the front and the backs, so the back strips are going to be a slightly different shade of blue. You can use whatever fabric you have for this, and you can mix and match. They don't have to be all the same colours. You can do them random, as your quilt is very random. From your long strips you need to cut some 6-inch strips. Now again, this will depend on how many squares you're going to do. Now I'm doing 80 in total, 8 per row. So I need 7 of the 6-inch strips to join my 8 pieces together. I need 70 for the front and I need 70 for the back, so I need 140 altogether. Once you've made all of your squares, trim them down to make sure they're all exactly the same size and all nice and square. It's very important to be accurate. Next, attach the strips together to make rows of 8. To do this, you need to take one of your strips and put it on the front of your first patchwork square and one piece on the back, and then either pin or clip in place. Then at your sewing machine, sew, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Then open out your strips on both sides and iron. Then place the next square on top of the original with right sides facing, and then you need to pin or clip it to just the top strip of fabric, not the bottom one, just the top one. And this is how it should look from the front and the back. And do like I do, just check that it looks like this before you sew. Then sew this new square to the original, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance and back tacking at the start and the finish. It's a little bit tricky and you might need to move the other seam on the other side out of the way while you sew it. Press the central seam, making sure that it lies nice and flat. If it doesn't, you may need to trim a little bit off each side, but you shouldn't. It should just fit, because that 1/4 inch seam allowance should make it exactly 1/2 inch, and then we fold under a 1/4 inch on the raw edge of the tape, and then fold it over and pin in place. Using the same method, continue attaching your squares until you have 8 of them. Add the next 2 strips of fabric to the side where you've already got 2 squares, and then we'll add the third one onto this. So pin these 2 strips in place. Then sew, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Iron the tape open on both sides before attaching the next piece. Trim off any loose threads, and then again take your next square and place it on top of the second square with right sides facing, and pin or clip in place. Then sew, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish, and press those 2 central seams so that they lay nice and flat. They should just butt up together nicely, and then turn over a 1/4 inch of the raw edge on your binding tape, and then fold this over and pin in place. When you have 8 of your squares all attached, you can then hand sew the back of them where we pin them together. I think it's best to hand sew them, but if you really want to, you could sew them on your sewing machine if you're very careful. I'll probably show you how to do that at the end, but for now I'm showing you how to hand sew them, and we're going to do a whip stitch down each of the squares to attach them at the back. That way you'll see no stitching on the front at all, and you'll just have the hand stitching on the back. So get yourself a needle and thread, tie a knot in the end, and we'll be ready to start. It doesn't take long actually, it's quite quick. To do this stitch, here's where we've come up, see? I'm going a little bit further forward from that. I'm going to take a little bit of the square fabric, and then at an angle, we come back up and we take a little bit of the strip fabric, okay, and pull. So we do that again. Here's where we've come out. Go forward a little bit, take a little bit of the square fabric, then come up at an angle and take a little bit of the strip fabric and pull again. And continue like this all the way to the end. And when you do your last stitch, loop your needle and thread through a couple of times, pull it tight to form a knot, and you're done. That's one done. 7 to go. No, 6 to go, because we only have 7 joins. 6 to go. Anyway, you carry on and do all of your joins, all 7 of your joins on each of your strips. Or if you wanted to, you could finish one and hand sew that, then go on to the next, add that strip and then hand sew it and keep going and hand sewing each one. But I actually like to do all my hand sewing together. I like to sit down with a cup of tea and have a nice relaxing go at hand sewing. If you don't want to hand stitch your strips of fabric down, then this is an alternative way to do. Start by joining the 2 strips as before, but when you come to attaching the second piece, instead of attaching it to the front strip, you attach it to the back strip. So it's exactly the same as before, but you're attaching it to the front strip and not the back strip. So this is how it should look this time. So taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish. Iron the strip on both sides. Then turn under a 1/4 inch on the front strip. Then fold it over and pin in place. Then top stitch an 1/8 inch away from the edge, back tacking at the start and the finish and removing the pins as you go along. And this is how it will look. You'll get a row of top stitching on the front and the back. You could also use the same method when joining the rows together. And if you wanted to, you could top stitch down the other side to make it match. When you have joined all of your squares together and formed as many rows as you would like, then we can start to join these rows together. And this is how to join the rows together. To join our 2 strips, we place one across and the other going down, so we form a right angle, and then we're going to draw a line across at 45 degrees, so basically from corner to corner, like so. Oops, no, that's not worked. Try again. From corner to corner. That's from this corner to this bottom corner, and then pin it and then just sew down this line on your sewing machine. The rows are joined in exactly the same way as the squares, apart from this time you need longer strips, and I find it easier to clip or pin. Actually, I find it easier to clip the front strip on first, so I put clips all the way along the front and then I turn it over and remove the clips I've already put on and attach the back strips, if that makes any sense. It's just easier that way than trying to do them both at once, one from the front and one from the back. So I get my front ones in place, flip it over, and then very carefully remove a clip at a time and attach the back strip so they're all nicely in line. Then sew, taking a 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish, and removing your pins or clips as you go along. Again, this process is exactly the same as the squares, so just iron out the strips of fabric that you've just sewn on both sides, press them nice and flat, then attach the 2 rows by placing the next row on top of the first row with right sides facing. And as you do this, as I'm doing, just check that your strips joining your squares are matching up with your strips on the other side, because there is a strip between them, so just keep checking every now and then that you are in line, and either pin or clip in place when you're sure you're lined up. And again, as before, you're just pinning or clipping to the top layer, or sorry, to the top strip, to the top blue strip, not the bottom one. We'll be hand sewing that again later. Then sew, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and the finish, and removing your clips as you go along. Then iron the seams flat on the reverse side. It looks like they won't lie flat, but if you pull at both sides of the quilt, you will get it to lie flat, and it should fit nice and flush, both of the seams. If it doesn't, like I said before, you could cut a little bit off, but they should fit. It should be just right. So iron all the way along on the reverse side. Then turn under the edge strip by 1/4 inch, as you did before. So turn it over and iron it in place, then fold it over and pin in place, and continue to pin all the way along to the end. Then hand stitch all the way along using a whip stitch like I showed you before. Continue to add the rest of the rows one at a time, always adding your strips of fabric to the quilt and not to the strip you're just about to add. I originally planned to have 10 rows, but I ended up with 11. To make the binding, cut strips of fabric 3 inches wide and join them using the same method as before. Place one strip on top of the other at a right angle and then draw a 45-degree angle line from corner to corner, pin in place, and then sew across the line that you've just drawn, backtacking at the start and the finish. You may need to join several pieces. I needed 4 for mine. When you've joined all your pieces together, press open the joins and then fold the piece of fabric in half lengthways all the way along the whole length. Then pin or clip to your quilt. So you're going to pin or clip, as I'm doing, to the right side of the quilt, and you want the raw edges of your binding against the raw edges of the quilt. Start halfway down one of the long sides and pin or clip to the corner. Don't go all the way because we're going to stop at the corner. When you're almost at the corner, mark 1/4 inch on each side. I'm using my friction pen so it irons off, but nobody's going to see this anyway, so I wouldn't worry too much about what you use because it's going to be hidden. So I mark 1/4 inch on both sides. Then I transfer that mark to the front of the binding so I can see it. If I don't do this, I sometimes put a pin in it, which is just as good. I missed filming most of this, but I've sewn down to the corner, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance, and I'm going to stop sewing exactly on the 1/4 inch mark that I left. I've just put a pin in to help me see it a little bit clearer from the side as well. So I carry on sewing down to the corner and finish with my needle down exactly on that 1/4 inch mark. I'm going to remove the pin, lift up my presser foot, and then turn around and go off to the corner at a 45-degree angle, and here I back tack. I then put my quilt on my cutting mat and make sure that I've got the top edge lined up with the squares and the side edge lined up with the squares, so I have a 90-degree angle in the corner, and I fold my fabric up making a 45-degree angle, and I finger press it. Then with my left hand holding it in place, I pull the rest of the binding tape down with my right hand and make sure there's a right angle at the top. I make sure it's all nice and level, and then I clip in place. Then using my friction pen, I put a mark 1/4 inch from the side. This is also 1/4 inch from the top. Then take back over to the sewing machine and start sewing directly on the mark that you've just made, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance, back tacking at the start and sewing all the way down to the next corner. Well, you'll do exactly the same process again, but don't sew right to where you started from. Leave about a 2-inch gap because we need to join the 2 pieces of binding tape. Next, you need to join the 2 pieces of binding. So turn under about 1/4 inch on the right hand side, and then using a hot iron, press this down. Cut off any excess binding on the other side, but make sure that you have 1 inch to 1.5 inches of overlap because we're going to thread this side through the other side. I then cut mine at a little bit of an angle just to make it go into the other side a little bit easier. I push it through and then I'm going to pin or clip it in place. Then sew closed, taking 1/4 inch seam allowance. Then, starting in the middle of one side, fold over your binding tape to the wrong side of the fabric, making sure that you overlap the original seam by about 1/8 inch. You can see the original seam, you just need to fold it over and overlap it by 1/8 inch all the way around. When I reach the corner, I normally put a couple of clips on the other side and then go back to do the mitered corner. Then push one of the sides all the way up to the top and fold the other one over, and you should end up with a nice neat corner, and the other side takes care of itself. Then continue all the way around the quilt like this, clipping all the way around. And remember to overlap that original row of stitching by an eighth of an inch, otherwise when we sew we're not going to catch this side in. Then we're going to sew on the right side of the fabric. That's why it's important you overlapped your original seam by an eighth of an inch. And we're going to stitch just to the side of the binding, not on the binding. We're going to stitch right next to it. So stitch all the way around very carefully. I've put my walking foot on now. I should have used this a lot earlier, but I didn't because my original one broke and I've only just received this one in the post. So very careful around those corners. As you can see, I'm going very slowly and removing the clips as I go, and I'm taking my time because I am sewing just to the side of the binding, so hopefully you won't be able to see this seam. Now there are two other ways you can do this. So if you're not confident doing it this way, you could actually sew just on the binding and you'll still catch the other side in. You'll have a little bit more of a gap at the side of the seam on the other side, but you'll catch it all in. So it's up to you. You either sew just to the side as I'm doing, or if you're not happy with that, sew just on the binding. So you only want to sew a 1/16 of an inch into the binding tape, if that's what you want to do. Now the other way to do it is to put the binding tape on the opposite way round. So instead of sewing it on the right side, you're going to sew it on the wrong side. So when you turn it over, you're then going to have the nice neat folded edge on the right side of the fabric, and then you can top stitch that down. Entirely up to you. If you don't want to do it this way, try that way. So anyway, carry on all the way around, sewing just inside the binding.
And thank you very much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you did, could you please like and subscribe?